Yep.
All right. I'm Trevor Williams. I'm with Global Atlanta, and we're here speaking with Sanjay Parekh. Is that how you say it? Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay,
Close enough.
great. Sanjay, why don't you, you're quite active in the startup community in Atlanta, but why don't you define a little bit what you do and
Sure.
what you have done,
Sorry, say that again.
and what you have done in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a technology entrepreneur here in the Atlanta community. I started up a company in 1999 to do IP-based locations, so knowing where somebody is on the internet, knowing only their IP address. So started that company in '99, raised about $12 million lifetime in funding for the company, and we ended up selling the company in 2007 to Landmark Communications, the former owners of the Weather Channel. Right. Since then, I've been involved in a number of things. I do an event now. We're coming up on the 6th annual event for Startup Riot, which is an annual event here in Atlanta that gets 30 startups up on stage to present for 3 minutes, 4 slides in front of a large pre-screened audience of attendees. This year, 2013, we'll hit a little north of 600 attendees. The first year in 2008, we were about 220 attendees.
Wow.
So the event has definitely grown. We attract people from all over. Last year, we had people as far away as the Ukraine that flew in just to attend the event. And we've had as far away as Australia from folks that were presenting at the event.
Wow.
So a lot of great coverage. CNN International has come and covered the event, Fast Company, AJC, Washington Post. Lots of folks have covered the event to kind of highlight the fact that entrepreneurs are finding success through the event and through what they're doing.
Well, we're here to talk about economic development, specifically in the city context. I know you've been outspoken about this issue and methodology behind this issue in Atlanta. Talk about the value of startups and small business in general to city economies, and about the approaches that some cities are taking in order to address this.
Yeah, so there was actually a research report from the Kauffman Foundation, which specializes in entrepreneurship, and they took a look at 30 years worth of data, I think from 1980 to 2010, and they found that in that time frame, companies that were less than 5 years old were net creators of jobs, and they were the only net creators of jobs. Looking at companies that were older than 5 years old, they were actually, on average, a net destroyer of jobs. And so, to me, what that says is that by spending time and focusing on small businesses and startups, that is really the way to create jobs and reduce unemployment. And so, to me, what we've been doing in terms of economic development has not necessarily been the right path. We spend a lot of time with big companies trying to move jobs from one location to another, and although that might get a lot of press, in the end, it doesn't really create jobs, and it doesn't create that economic prosperity that we're looking for.
Is this, in terms of net creation and destruction of jobs, is that looking at it from a national perspective or from a city or a state perspective?
That's looking at it from a national perspective.
So in other words, you're having jobs move from one place in the country to another, and so while one region may benefit, another may not. So it's
well, that's actually looking at just job creation across the country, regardless of where the jobs are moving. Now, that point too, to me, that doesn't make any sense either, right? So, if we look at it as the perspective of Americans rather than of Georgians or Atlantans or Guanetians, paying money to move jobs from one location to another doesn't actually accomplish anything for us as Americans. And that, I think, is one of our challenges in terms of folks that do economic development, is that they aren't incented to think in that term. They're incented to think on, how many jobs did I create here? And in fact, they didn't actually create jobs, they actually just moved jobs.
Right. But what would you say to an economic developer who has, his whole job is to, or his or her whole job is to create, vitality in their own community and attract that inbound investment, and maybe it's from overseas, not necessarily from the Rust Belt to Metro.
I would say that even then they are playing the short game rather than the long game, and they really need to be playing the long game. And the people that employ the economic development folks, they need to be thinking about the long game, because if you look at the stats, like I said, at the Kauffman Foundation, those jobs that you're moving into your communities are going to be net destroyers of jobs. Those jobs are going to go away at some point. And the other thing that's happening by focusing on those big companies is that you're concentrating your jobs into fewer and fewer hands, right? So you've got bigger and bigger companies controlling more and more jobs, and then when something bad happens to that company, you've got this massive layoff that ends up happening that could devastate the economy there, and the economy cannot fully absorb the impact of that. And it's just like what financial planners tell us to do with our own finances, with our own investments. You don't put all of your money into one company. You diversify it across. And by spending that time and making sure that job growth is happening across the spectrum, along with small businesses and small startups, you're cushioning the economy. I mean, you have one small business that goes under 4 or 5 jobs, your economy should be able to absorb that. But when you have all of a sudden 10,000 jobs that are just freed up, 10,000 people looking for work, that's a hard thing to kind of recover from.
Right. But of course, I'm sure you'd probably concede that you need some of the larger companies in order to fund the smaller ventures, and it kind of becomes a virtuous cycle.
I absolutely agree, but the difference is that I think you can create those big companies from those small companies.
Gotcha.
I think if you kind of help these companies along, they will become big companies eventually. I mean, you think about, like, I was looking, the New York Times said that Georgia spends about $1.8 billion in tax incentives a year. That's a large amount of money, and in the year that they analyzed, the Caterpillar was one of the largest at 7. Right. If AGCO actually is based here in Georgia, and they're right around the corner from me here in Duluth.
Right.
Do the same business, right? Where's AGCO's $70-something million? It's not there. But besides that point, if something bad happens to Caterpillar, do you think they're going to let go of jobs in their headquarters in Peoria, or are they going to let go of jobs here?
True. However, AGCO is manufacturing in France and Algeria and other places. So
no, I absolutely. But maybe they'd manufacture here if they had $70 million in incentives.
I don't know. I mean, I think the incentives sometimes, they come after, not after the fact, but after the company has decided to locate in a certain area. And then, I think the economic developers would argue that in order to be competitive with other states, you have to kind of ante up. And
but that's the problem, right? It's like mutually assured destruction. Everybody just keeps upping the ante, and the tax revenues just keep going down because of it. And if everybody disarmed at the same time, then these folks that are running these big companies could actually make decisions based on the actual economic realities. Because the fact is, look, these big companies, they have the wherewithal and they have the clout to get these tax incentives. I've never heard of many. Well, I'm sure there are startups that have gotten tax incentives, but there's very few. And I would argue that those folks, the folks that are just starting out, are probably the ones that need to be nurtured more than the big companies.
Yeah. Well, let's flip. We could keep going on that subject all day. Let's flip to more of the positive side. I mean, I know that Atlanta has this new Startup Atlanta initiative. I know Athens has a new incubator. I mean, there are a lot of cities that are starting to recognize some of what you're saying about the fact that vitality starts from the ground up. And is that encouraging to you? Are these efforts sustainable, and what should they really focus on in order to make them so?
Yeah, so I mean, we still have a lot of challenges. I think there's been a couple of bright spots too. One of the challenges that I think we've seen for the longest time is that although we have, I think, the number 5 most Fortune 500 companies in the metro area of Atlanta, we don't have a lot of interaction between these big companies and startups, and that is a big problem, I think, for us, kind of as a community. But that said, I think there's some bright spots. Cox Communications just announced a $250 million fund that they're putting together. It doesn't seem like it's directly that money is going to go into startups, but it's going to be into kind of new innovations that they're incubating themselves. I think that's a good sign. I think it signals really well that they have faith in kind of the community here. The fact that we're graduating so many bright kids out of colleges. I think that's a good thing. I think if we can hold on, and that's been one of our challenges, is that we don't have the opportunities, and we end up educating all these kids, and then they end up going somewhere else, and we lose this talent, and it's a bad thing for us as a community. It's great that we're making money on the fact that we're educating them, but if we can keep them, I think the long-term payoff is there. So that's a great thing. We've seen some other things like that too. Home Depot has gotten really active and involved in the startup community here, and that's a good thing as well. So
I know UPS is invested in some technologies that are kind of integral to their business at the startup stage, and kind of brought those along. So I guess what I'm hearing you saying, for to kind of broaden the focus a little bit for more listeners or viewers is that communities need to get their existing corporate community involved and integrated into this discussion about small.
Right. Absolutely. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they need to spend money, I don't think. Even if they just spend time and give advice, or just let entrepreneurs know about the problems that they're facing, right? I mean, that's kind of what entrepreneurs do, right? We're looking for problems to solve, but we can't solve the problems if we don't know what they are. Yeah. And so, just by letting people know, I think you get a lot of action because of that. So I think we're starting to see more and more progress down that path of better and better integration. We still have a long way to go, but nothing's ever perfect. So if we didn't have this to deal with, we'd have something else to deal with. So
these government efforts to kind of integrate resources that could help small businesses, do you encourage those?
Yeah, absolutely. I think anything that can be done to kind of help in terms of communication and in terms of the interaction between all these groups, I think that's a great thing. The Chamber of Commerce is kind of all throughout the city, the state ones, or the city one, the county ones, they all do a great job. Part of the challenge, though, is that a lot of entrepreneurs that are doing cutting edge stuff, their heads down, and they don't go to events. I mean, that's the other part of the problem. It's not just that the corporates aren't going to things and meetings, but it's also the startups a lot of times are not going out, right? Because we get like this tunnel vision of like, this is the problem I'm trying to solve, and I'm going to ignore everything else that's going on out there. And so we've got to get out of that shell and look around, because I think there's a lot of great relationships that happen. And as entrepreneurs, eventually you're going to move on to something else, and if you've got those relationships, it makes doing the next thing even easier. Yeah.
I know that one challenge in terms of the talent leaving Atlanta and going to other places has been the venture capital scene, that people feel like if they're going to take their idea and their company to the next step, that there's not really an ingrained funding mechanism in the city in order to do that. And so we see a lot of them going to Silicon Valley and other places where they're, especially in medical devices and in biotech and things that we're, from the top down side, we're trying to promote as strategic industries for the state.
Yeah.
Tell me about how that's going, and just talk in general about what you'd like to see from city and state legislatures to kind of encourage this vision of creating business.
So I have a very non-popular opinion in terms of one of the things that we did pass a while back, which was the angel tax credit. I don't think, I did an analysis on that tax credit. I don't think it was a good tax credit for taxpayers. If you do the math in terms of the credit that angels have to get, they basically have to be 7 times more successful than the average angel investor for the Georgia taxpayer to be made whole. To me, as a taxpayer, I don't think that makes sense. I'm also potentially a recipient of the tax credit, and I still don't think it makes sense. I think that money would have been better spent elsewhere. We do have some challenges in terms of the lack of capital here, but that said, capital moves, and capital doesn't stay stuck in one location. If there actually is a good idea here, capital will find it. And it's a shame for the fact that we don't have enough VCs here to take advantage of that, but it is what it is. There's been a number of companies that have gotten money from blue chip firms out west, and the companies continue to stay here. We've had some companies that have moved, definitely, and it's not necessarily always the reason for capital. It's also access to customers as well as access to talent. So there's that too, and those are things that I think we could fix. We talk about the corporates being more involved here locally. I think that helps fix the client side of it. If we can keep the talent that we're graduating from Georgia Tech and other schools here, then that helps fix the talent issue as well. So none of it's insurmountable. I think eventually capital will start coming here, and I've heard that there's a number of firms that are raising funds kind of right now and this year. So there's a potential that there's a lot of money that might be sloshing around here soon, hopefully, but we'll see what happens.
So our legislators, obviously, there's all this discussion about whether government can create jobs or not, and we won't really get into that. But are they powerless in terms of where the businesses move, or does creating an environment that's receptive to new and small businesses play a role in where these companies end up and where the talent goes?
Yeah, I think Yes, they can play a role. They can help. Or maybe we should say they can avoid hurting. Is maybe the better option
Right.
of words. I think a lot of times what we end up having is entrepreneurs that are already here
Mm-hmm.
that end up then leaving. I think it's
Mm.
really hard to get entrepreneurs to move here.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think we're at that point where we've got really the good PR and proposition value that we could say that it makes sense to
Mm-hmm.
move here. In some case, we do. It really depends on the industry and on the entrepreneur. But I think a lot of times, I think the ones that we need to really focus on are the entrepreneurs that are already here, that are starting something up that we have a risk of losing.
Yeah.
And we've lost quite a few over the years. And I think it's easier to keep the ones that we already have than trying to attract ones that we don't have yet.
Yeah. Yeah. So are there any special laws or regulations that we should either get rid of or adopt here I know the legislative session is coming up in the state. If you've got anything you'd like to comment on, that'd be great.
Well, I mean, I think the one that stands out to me as probably the worst of the last few years was that amendment a couple of years ago. I think it was 2010. It was Amendment number 2 that strengthened the non-compete laws here in Georgia. I think that was horrific. It was a bad amendment. It was worded in such a way on the ballot that it made it sound like it was a good thing. It made it more restrictive. It was bad for startups, bad for entrepreneurs, bad for employees. I mean, the fact that employees might now not be able to go into the same industry that they're working in, and if they've got something novel and want to compete in that same industry, that they might get slammed down by a non-compete. That's bad for Georgia. It's just a bad thing. So, unfortunately, now that it's an amendment to the Constitution, it would require probably an amendment to nullify that amendment. And there was one large company that spent $1 million to get that amendment passed, and unfortunately, us as startups, we don't have that kind of money to fight something like that. And so, I think the thing that I would say is that when there are laws coming through and amendments that are being proposed that are being backed by big business, that legislators really need to take a look at and understand what is the impact on small business. The people that are not lobbying, the people, and I understand it. Those big companies are the ones that are doing campaign donations and all that, and but if these legislators really care about creating jobs and sustaining jobs, they need to worry about the ones that aren't lobbying and aren't doing the campaign donations, because they're really the ones that are creating the jobs. And that's really going to be the difference between their area of the world being prosperous economically or not.
So I guess last question, because we've kind of gone a little bit long, but I was wondering, what in terms of physical infrastructure do you think is encouraging to entrepreneurs? I mean, I know that we have in Atlanta, we have the ATDC, and as I mentioned in Athens, a lot of these communities are starting to create spaces, physical spaces where entrepreneurs can be and share ideas, and they get free or cheap rent, and they can. Is that just an encourager? Is that something that's going to create new activity, or is it just going to facilitate what's already going on?
Yeah, so we've got a lot of great infrastructure, and there's a lot of new stuff coming on board too, and I'll mention some of it. First of all, ATDC, the nation's oldest incubator throughout the nation. So, a lot of times we don't think about that, we don't realize that we've got such a crown jewel, something that's been around longer than anywhere else in the U.S. And they've done a great job. They've got some challenges, obviously, and maybe that's another area where, encourage legislators to act, is that, they need more funding. Their funding keeps getting cut. And like I said, this is the place where they are actively helping entrepreneurs create jobs and do innovative things here in Georgia. And that shouldn't be cut. The other thing that we've got Hippopotamus, which is down by Georgia Tech in Biltmore. Great co-working facility. There's a new one, Atlanta Tech Village, that's being started in Buckhead, actually by an entrepreneur who started a company, Pardot, which was bootstrapped. And so he didn't take any outside money, and he sold it for $95.5 million to Exact Target last year. And so he's taking some of that money and he's reinvesting into the community. And so he's created basically a working facility. And the thing that I think that these facilities end up doing is, they don't create the opportunities, but what they do is they create the serendipity, right? That chance encounter. And that's the thing that we've been missing. And that's one of the challenges that we've got as Atlantans, is that we all know we've got this sprawl issue, right? I mean,
Right.
anywhere you go, if you're meeting anybody, it's going to be half an hour, 40 minutes to drive there. We've got a transportation issue. So if we could fix our transportation, get MARTA into Gwinnett, get MARTA up into Cobb, get it to places where people want to go. I mean, it would make my life easier. I drive 20 minutes to the Doraville station so I can take MARTA in. But that would help in terms of the sprawl issue. But because of that sprawl, we lack this opportunity for serendipity to happen. And you look at other places, and I'm not saying that we need to be like the Valley or anything, but if you look at like Palo Alto, whenever I go there, if I'm walking down the street, inevitably I will run into a dozen people that I know just on the street. By happenstance. We don't have that here because we're all kind of locked into our cars. And so by creating these places where we can kind of concentrate all these folks together at the same time, you have that serendipity. You have that random talk, or you just happen to be walking into the building with folks. So I think that's a great thing. The other thing that I think, in the world I live in, is the internet and software startups, is better access to the internet, right? Higher speeds, higher availability, more bandwidth. If we could do things to encourage that kind of stuff, that infrastructure to build out, I think it doesn't just help the startups. I think it helps all of our businesses, because new things will bubble up because of that.
Great. Well, thanks so much for talking with us.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Talk to you soon.
Yep.